Hello and welcome to the Arc Woman podcast. This is an exploration of womankind. Here we discuss what it is to be a woman in the modern world while utilizing ancient and modern modalities in tandem to create a bounty of health for the body, mind and spirit.
G'day everyone and welcome back to the pod. I hope you're having a beautiful morning, afternoon or evening wherever you are in the world. Today we are talking all things UTIs, recurrent UTIs, the physiology behind them, and I guess like what you've been told about cranberry, D-mannose and wiping the right way and how that's only like 10% of the story and what the evidence actually shows. But before we get into it today, let's pay our respects to the elders past, present and future residing in the lands of Litchfield, Tasmania, where I'm recording this podcast today. Always has, always will be, baby. More than half of women will have a UTI by the age of 32. So that's almost a third will have another one within 6 months. That's a few million billion women having UTIs. And the whole public conversation about how to stop that from happening is built around what your mother told you, what a cranberry marketing campaign told you, and what a supplement brand told you. How convenient. And not surprisingly, none of it is actually reflecting what the evidence actually says. In fact, in the last 3-4 years, the science around the prevention of UTIs has been completely rearranged. The biggest, best designed trial of D-mannose, that supplement that you've been told to take, I told you to take, everyone found it does not work. D-mannose is fairly ineffective. In fact, instead, a drug most of us have never heard of called methenamine hippurate was shown to be as effective as a long-term antibiotic without any resistant problem. That is a huge, huge thing. A sublingual vaccine has recorded infection-free rates well over 50%, and a very, very hyped injectable vaccine failed its phase 3 trial in February of last year and was pulled. $250 million did not work for a vaccine, and instead this sublingual vaccine has recorded infection-free rates. So we're going to be talking about that as well. At the same time, the fundamental biology of what a UTI is and how it works has even changed. We now understand that your bladder is not sterile, it has a microbiome. We've actually known that for over a decade, even though most doctors and health providers will tell you otherwise. I think a lot of people will say urine is sterile. That is not the truth necessarily. Your bladder and even your ureter has a microbiome. E. coli, the bug behind 80% of UTIs, does not just splash around in your bladder, it grips onto the wall using molecular hooks and burrows into the cells, and it builds hidden colonies inside of your own tissue that antibiotics cannot always reach. So that explains the recurrency of some UTIs in some women. This episode, I hope, is going to give you the full picture. It's not a wellness formula. It's not a clinical shrug. We're just going to look at the whole science, the actual evidence, and we're also going to be looking at the hierarchy of that evidence and how we can basically sort it out. And I'm going to explain it in a way that, of course, hopefully you understand really, really well. We're going to be sitting down. This is just a solo podcast. Hopefully it goes for about an hour. Sit down, go for your walk, grab your tea, settle in. Let's talk all things UTIs. I was talking about the evidence hierarchy before. This is how I'm going to be organizing it. So maybe you can come back to this at the start if you're like, wait, what is middle tier again? So top tier, again, is that large, well-designed randomized controlled trial or meta-analysis. Mid-tier is a mechanistically plausible, mixed or moderate evidence. Low tier is preliminary, so we're only just finding out the science, small or heavily anecdotal. A lot of what of kind of online wellness spaces will sell you is kind of that low tier being marketed as top tier, D-mannose being a really good example of that. I actually saw someone online who calls themselves a gut health expert who has no accredited training whatsoever, talking about how D-mannose can treat a UTI, which is incredibly problematic because that's not true. And what we know about D-mannose is that it's pretty low tier evidence for treating or even preventing a UTI. You have to remember as well, UTIs, you should be taking very, very seriously. I think a lot of women have them, and because they're so common, we normalize dysfunction. And I think just because of the simple biology of our ureter being fairly close to our anus and our rectal sphincter, that there is a bit of bacteria in this area that can creep upwards. And we are, as women, because of our anatomy, a little bit more susceptible to UTIs in comparison to men. So there's that kind of just physiology and why we're a little bit more susceptible to it. I think wiping the right way is something that women have been told, which is a really, really condescending. That's not necessarily what's going on a lot of the time, but that's just kind of what male doctors will say because of that reasoning of our anatomical function. But just because they are so prevalent and you might have them all the time does not mean they should be normalized and they should go untreated. I had a UTI so badly that I ended up in hospital. I'll tell you the story. I was working with Indigenous people and we were out on a camp and I had my period and I was wearing period underwear for the first time. And at this camp, we didn't have a good place basically to wash. And I did my absolute best. I was using lots of wet wipes. I was making sure I was wiping the right way, all of these things. But I was in the Northern Territory. It was hot. I had a really heavy bleed and I didn't have proper sanitation, even though I really tried to keep myself clean and had kind of a wipe down, if you know what I mean, every single day. But when I flew home after this work trip, I got a UTI so bad. Back when this was happening, I had finished my degree, but I wasn't really looking to the evidence as I do now. And I wasn't looking into evidence hierarchy. And I was just kind of following a few people online who I really believed. And there were people online like this gut health guy I was talking about before saying like cranberry juice, D-mannose, all of these things can treat UTIs. And so I thought, okay, great. I have a little bit of a UTI. It hurts when I pee. So I'm just going to do what these people online are telling me to do. And one night I woke up in the night with the most incredible pain I've ever felt in my life, just in this huge heat in my back, on one side of my back, and just so much pain. Like I felt like I had a fire inside of me from my ureter and immediately knew that something was wrong. This is at 3:00 in the morning. And I just drove myself to the hospital. I presented and I was like, guys, something is really wrong. I think I have a really serious infection. And of course it was a Saturday night and there were a bunch of people in there that they needed to prioritize in front of me. They just basically gave me some paracetamol and told me to wait. And I was writhing around in pain, lying down on these plastic chairs, kept going up every 20 minutes being like, can you please help me? Something is so seriously wrong. I'm in so much pain. They just kept giving me painkillers. And I was just like, okay, this is a nightmare. I feel like I'm going to die or I'm going to lose a kidney. I finally get in there and they take my labs and everyone's in the room immediately. They are talking about dialysis. They are talking about surgery. They are talking about all of these things. And thank God there was this amazing doctor in there. And she was like, okay, wait a second, guys, let's just get her on some really strong antibiotics and antivirals. And let's just put her on a drip. Let's just give her some really powerful painkillers and keep an eye on her. And within an hour, they came back and they said that they had been very surprised by my white blood cells, which is very concerning to hear in an emergency room. Emergency doctors have been in the industry for a very, very long time. They're very experienced. When they say that, you should be very concerned. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to lose a kidney. I'm going to lose a kidney. And they were like, your kidney is doing really badly. All of your markers are out, all this stuff. We're going to keep you overnight. And so I stayed there the night and I eventually got it's a miracle. They got my white blood cells down to a certain point and they kept me there for a while. And in the morning they were like, hey, you're looking really good. We're actually going to discharge you because they don't have any room in the actual hospital to take me in. And my labs miraculously turned around and they were like, how close are you to the hospital? And I said, I'm literally 5 minutes away. And they said, cool. Okay, we want you to present tomorrow. We can do labs again. And we're just going to keep a really close eye on you. And I went home and just collapsed. And I really couldn't get out of bed for about 3 days from this infection. That's an insane story. I want you to hear that. I had a UTI. I listened to people online and their shonky advice, and I almost died. I almost lost a kidney. Okay. I almost lost a fucking kidney. If I lost the other one, I would have had to be on dialysis. So let this be your story. Please don't believe people online. This thing that happened to me radicalized me. And I started to go, I need to start reading the evidence myself because I don't trust these fuckers online. And that's why I have these sentiments, because I almost had a very, very serious life event. And I think you need to remember the reason why people don't die from UTIs is because of antibiotics. Okay. They are life-saving medicine. There is a time and a place for antibiotics. I know if you have recurrent infections, you really don't want to take them. But if it gets to a point where you're starting to feel back pain, you need to take antibiotics. You need to present to your emergency doctor. You need to go to a doctor immediately. Okay. There are people dying in the West from UTIs because they refuse antibiotics. Are you about that life? You're going to die for someone online telling you that D-mannose works when it doesn't? I hope not. So that's my story. Please listen to health providers. Please use antibiotics. I'm very pro antibiotics for this. I will just say that at the outset. When we're talking about UTIs, it's a lot about prevention and it's a lot about what's happening. And why do women get more UTIs and how can we prevent that from happening? As I say, there is no prevention that you can do at home that isn't antibiotics. Okay, if you have a UTI and it's starting to get into that symptom where you're seeing the infection move up into your kidneys, take it seriously. Okay, so let's move on to the numbers and why this episode exists. So the epidemiology alone should convince you that we're not paying attention to this in the way that it really truly deserves. So women contract UTIs up to 30 times more frequently than men, and we went and talked about the reason why previously. Up to 4 in 10 women who have a UTI will have another within 6 months. And recurrent, so this is the definition of what is a recurrent UTI, is 2+ in 6 months or 3+ in 12 months, okay? And so that's a lot less than what I see women presenting in my clinic with. And that affects 20 to 30% of women who have had an initial infection. UTIs account for roughly 15% of all community antibiotic prescriptions. That's a lot. That's a lot of antibiotic prescriptions just for UTIs. And that number should make you sit up, right? One of the biggest drivers of antibiotic use in women and therefore antibiotic resistance in women is a condition that we barely take seriously as a research priority. Are we surprised? No. Are we shocked? Yes. So direct US healthcare cost, it costs more than $3.5 billion a year. That's how much it costs in one country for UTIs in women. Indirect burden, so work lost, broken sleep, sexual withdrawal, the psychological toll of never trusting your body and when it's about to flare up. And so where are we now in 2026? So last year, the 2025 AUA, CUA, and SUFU guideline update is the biggest reordering of the prevention evidence in over a decade. So we are working from that framework and that guideline up. So the interventions that were previously fringe and really now recommended, and some interventions are still being aggressively sold to you, do not actually meet the evidence bar within this guideline. So that reordering is not filtering down to an average clinical care yet, but we're going to work through it. Hello, if you're a healthcare provider and you're listening to this, welcome. Please go and find that. I'll just read it out again so you can find it. It's the 2025 AUA, CUA, and SUFU guideline update on urinary tract infections. Just broadly, a lot of the data in that is on women because women overrepresent this infection, of course. So how your urinary tract actually works. Let's talk about the physiology behind this so you can understand how a UTI can come about. So let's talk about your plumbing, right? So it's a one-way filtration and drainage system. You have 2 kidneys. They filter about 180 liters of plasma daily. Almost all of it is reabsorbed. And what is not reabsorbed is left, and it is concentrated into 1 to 2 liters of urine. If you're a thirsty girl like me, you might be thinking, God, I'm more like the 4 to 5. So urine drains through the ureters, so 1 from each kidney into the bladder. So your bladder is basically this amazing muscle. It's a muscular reservoir, and on voiding, it will contract and the sphincters and the pelvic floor will relax and urine will leave the urethra, and the opposite will happen when it is filling with urine, which is basically plasma from waste from your entire body. So basically, plasma is your blood, how your blood travels through your circulatory system. So all your veins, all of your blood vessels goes through your heart. It's pretty amazing, actually. It goes to every single cell in your body. And that goes through the kidneys that filter it. And then that filters down through the ureters to your bladder and then to your urethra, and it comes out. So again, that one-way filtration and drainage system in the body. So the defense system of this, the first one is the urothelium. So the bladder is lined by a specialized epithelium called the urothelium. The outer layer is an enormous flattened cells called umbrella cells because they look like open umbrellas under a microscope. They're actually quite cute. They can live up to 6 months, which is pretty amazing, and they're armored in 3 ways. So 1, they have tight junctions, just like the ones that we have in our colonocytes. In our gut, we have tight junctions that glue the cells together so nothing leaks between them. We also have uroplakin plaques, and they're crystalline protein plates that make up the surface almost impermeable. And the GAG layer, gag, she's gagged. The gag layer, slippery sulfated sugar coating, and that makes bacteria struggle to grip on the inside of your bladder. There is a little bit of a horrible little irony here, evolutionary speaking. Uroplakins are coated in mannose sugars. E. coli has evolved a molecular hook that grabs onto mannose. So the sugar inside of uroplakin plaques, that's that crystalline protein plate that makes it hard for bacteria to get past into us, past the bladder, is basically they have hooks onto the sugar that make up part of that structure, basically. Lock that in, okay? Lock it in the back of your head, write it down with your pen and paper. That explains why most interventions we discuss for the rest of the hour work or do not work, okay? Because of the mannose sugar inside of your uroplaque and plaques. Defense 2, the flow. Urine flow itself is a defense, which is why when people say if you have a UTI, you feel one coming on, drink. Drink lots of water, because flowing it out mechanistically will flush and physically washes bacteria out before they establish. Urine also contains antimicrobial peptides and secretory IgA, and it also contains something called uromodulin, and that's a decoy that looks like a mannose sugar to E. coli. So it basically traps them and goes, haha, here's a fake mannose sugar that we're going to put in the urine. It grabs onto that and it acts as a hostage tag in a way, and they both leave in the urine mechanistically. Your body evolved a decoy for the exact hook that E. coli uses. How amazing is that? How amazing is that? Defense 3, the female anatomy problem. So the predisposition is anatomical, not behavioral. So the female urethra is about 4 centimeters away from our rectum, and male urethra is about 20 centimeters. The female urethral opening also sits close to the vagina and the anus, right? So a short commute from the gut reservoir to your sterile bladder. So this is not hygiene failing, it's just your anatomy, right? The framing that I think women with UTI get a lot of the time, it's because they're not clean enough, you're not wiping the right way, you're not urinating fast enough after sex, and that's done the real harm. Right? So lots of behavioral blame here, decades of blame on women who are fundamentally set up by their own anatomy. I think this is just a funny one, right? Unfortunately, this is what you get when we have male doctors who just don't know how to communicate sensitively and just don't know that this is just an evolutionary fallout that will impact women so negatively just by the setup of their anatomy. Basically, what I'm trying to say, you don't get UTIs because you're dirty. You get them because your urethra is 4 centimeters long and it opens up into real estate crowded by 2 bacterial neighborhoods that like to colonize in a way and like to move around a lot. So you understand all of that. Wonderful. Let's move on to what a UTI actually is. So this is the taxonomy. So we have asymptomatic bacteria. We have bacteria in the urine, no symptoms. This is really common in older women. Do not treat. So if we have asymptomatic bacteria turning up in a urine sample and that woman is not showing any symptoms of a UTI, you do not treat, right? If an older woman is told her urine has bacteria in it, but she feels fine, that alone does not justify antibiotics, okay? I think that should be really rare. It's usually in pregnant women and older women when they do a urine sample, sometimes their health provider will come back and say, you have a UTI, you need to take antibiotics. If you are asymptomatic, the guidelines I've read and the literature as it suggests at present suggests that you shouldn't be treated for that if you're asymptomatic. Maybe you could go, okay, interesting. I'm going to take this antibiotic and I'm just going to keep an eye on it. And if I start to show symptoms, I will start taking it, right? You could do that. That's an option for you. So that's kind of the first UTI. It is a urinary tract infection, but it's asymptomatic, so we don't treat it. Next, we have cystitis. This is a bladder infection. So this is the burning, this is the constant urge, this is that aching above your pubic bone, sometimes visible in blood. So sometimes when you pee, you can see a little bit of blood. That's what we're going to spend most of this episode on. And then we have urethritis. So that's the urethra alone, and it overlaps with several STIs. So STI scans might be a part of the workup. And then we have what I had, which is the infection of the kidney. This is serious. I had fever, chills, flank pain. Flank is kind of your back, nausea, vomiting, and it can progress to sepsis, which is basically your body is infected. That's so serious. Please take that very, very serious. If you have burning, if you have fever, if you've one-sided lower back pain or both sides, that's not like a wait and see situation, doll. That's not a wait and see diva. Go to your GP, go to the ED. That's the single most important safety point of this episode. Don't do what I did. Don't be a dum-dum like I was and listen to assholes on the internet who have no credentials telling you what to do, who don't know how to read through the evidence, right? Okay, go to the ED, go to your GP. I think I've drilled that in. I think I have. Recurrent UTIs. So 2+ in 6 months, 3+ in 12 months. Once you cross that threshold, you need preventative strategies, not just an episode by episode treatment. And we will be talking about how you can treat that, how you can prevent, and also how we can actually work on possible dysbiosis in the system. Chronic UTIs. So this is a pretty contested term. even recurrent for a little bit. Sometimes some people don't like it, but chronic UTI is really contested. This is persistent, embedded infections that standard cultures really miss. The science of this mechanism is really quite real, but treatment protocols are contested. So no one can make their mind up on this, and we'll come back to this. So let's talk about E. coli. So the reason why we're talking about E. coli is because 80 to 90% of your community-acquired uncomplicated UTIs are caused by this one strain, which is known as UPEC, E. coli. So ordinarily, E. coli lives harmlessly in your gut. UPEC is a subtype that has evolved that specific toolkit for colonizing into your urinary tract. So what does that mean? The bug that gives you UTIs often comes from your gut microbiome. So using an evolutionary strategy to move from one niche microbiome, your gut, to another, your vagina, to another, your bladder and your kidneys and your ureter. So step one, the grip. UPEC covers itself in like these hair-like filaments called fimbriae or pili. The most important class is this type 1 fimbriae, and the tip of that sits on a protein called FimH, basically this fancy little hair. FIMH. That's the adhesion here. So FimH's job is to bind to mannose sugars. Okay, remember that hook we were talking about before? That's type 1 fimbriae, FimH, okay, little hook. So what's coated in mannose sugars? That uroplankton that is on our umbrella cells, they can hook onto those. So step one of every single UTI, that E. coli moves from your gut, from your colon basically, into your ureter and into your bladder. And then that FimH hook will grab the mannose on that cell inside of your bladder, the uroplankton, and without the grip, bacteria get flushed out. With it, they are anchored against the flow so they can hold on. Imagine you're in a river and you're a UPEC and you're holding on to a rock, right? You have these hooks. So this is also the mechanism behind D-mannose. Flood the urine with free mannose. So E. coli will go, wow, this is a party. I'm going to grab onto all of these instead of the bladder wall, and it gets flushed out. It's a lovely theory, and we'll get back to whether this holds up in trials later on. So step 2 is the invasion. So we are holding on with our hooks, the FimH hooks. We're binding the triggers in the bladder, and we're starting to internalize bacterium. The cell is starting to swallow the bacteria, right? So inside of the cytoplasm, so basically the plasma inside of the cell, E. coli replicates. So hooking on, getting into cell, replication. So it's not replicating as bacteria, it's actually replicating as a really tightly packed structure, thousands of bacteria clustered inside a single bladder cell, and it's shielded by your own cell wall because it's inside the cell. If you take an antimicrobial, right, an antibacterial supplement, an antibacterial medication, it's inside the cell. So it can't be treated, right? So this type of E. coli that's inside of the cell is called an intracellular bacterial community, also known as an IBC. So this was first described by Anderson et al. In Science in 2003. Its developmental pathway was then elaborated by Justice et al. In PNAS in 2004. So if you want any of the resources for this, also remember all of the sources that I use to put together these podcasts are always accompanying the accompanying article on this same subject on my Substack and Patreon. So you can join via the links in this bio and you can get all of the sources so you can get all of these studies. What these guys found basically was a single bacterium can grow into an IBC of more of 10,000 organisms inside a singular cell, hidden from antibiotics, hidden from immune cells. Okay. So that's the recurrency that we're seeing here. It's a very smart little bacterium. Step 3, the dormant reservoir. Okay. So not all the bacteria stay actively in the replicating pool. Some will drop into kind of this dormant state. This is called a quiescent intracellular reservoir. QIRS. These are these sleeper cells. They're really metabolically quiet. They're sitting in the deeper layer of your bladder walls. They're not replicating fast enough for antibiotics to catch on. And the immune cells around this area are like, everything looks normal because they're really smart and they're keeping super quiet. They're hiding away. They can wake up weeks to months later and seed a brand new infection, right? And so this was worked out in 2006 by Maya Sokar and Hultgren in PNAS. So this is the single best explanation for why women take an antibiotic. They feel better and then they get another UTI 6 weeks later, okay? Because the infection was never fully cleared. The short antibiotic use and that course cleared the actively replicating in extracellular bacteria, so outside of the cell, that were causing the symptoms, and the intracellular reservoir was sitting there the whole time, okay? So if your immune cells can't see it, your antibacterial and antimicrobial can't see it either, okay? So this is the biological reality of why neither wellness nor mainstream medicine really can grapple with and understand specifically chronic UTIs that women have. If antibiotics and even things like D-mannose, they cannot find intracellular reservoirs of E. coli, okay? There is no medicine that encourages our immune cells to go and find out, become really good at detecting E. coli. This is a relationship that we've had with E. coli for such a long time. Modern science has only been around for about 100 years, okay, versus billions of years of evolution, okay? So that's where we're at, and that's why I guess women have these chronic infections. It's because E. coli is incredibly smart and our immune system can't fight them because they're really good at hiding out. Okay, what about the other pathogens? Okay, because there are about maybe 4 other ones that we generally see, like staph is one of them, enterococcus is one of them. It's generally the same broad logic with E. coli. They grab on with a hook and they adhere onto the cell, they invade the cell, and they form a reservoir and they hide out, okay? So with each of them, of course, they're all quite different, but they use the same mechanism, which I think is quite amazing and very, very smart of these little bacteria. So one of the biggest things that you've been told about your body is that your bladder is sterile because urine is sterile, not necessarily. So again, as I said previously, the bladder has its own microbiome. It's called the urobiome. And if you're interested, I spoke about this with Dr. Moira Bradfield-Stratum a couple of years ago, and I had her on the podcast to talk about her PhD in vaginal and penile microbiomes. And we also talked about the microbiome inside of our bladder, the urobiome. So if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about the vaginal microbiome and how it plays into UTIs, that's a really great one to go and listen to as well. But the urobiome was recognized formally around 2010 to 2014. It took a really long time, so like 4 years, because standard urine culture was blind to it. So why a standard culture of urine misses the microbiome is really interesting. So that we take a very small volume of urine, so a tiny little cup. I think a few of us have done that. We incubate it for a short period of time, and we also use it and test it in aerobic conditions. So there's oxygen around, which doesn't really make any sense, because when we actually look at how we're testing, there isn't a small volume of urine. There is a large volume of urine. When we have our first pee in the morning, it's about a whole cup. It's not incubating for a short period of time, right? Because our urine stays in our bladder for up to 8 hours, and it's not aerobic. It's anaerobic. So how we were testing our urine and testing for a microbiome actually didn't make any sense, right? It's slow, it's fastidious, it's often anaerobic bacteria that make up your resident bladder community in your urobiome. So that's why it took us a little bit longer, because the context of how we were thinking about it didn't actually make sense when we look at the context of how our bladder actually is and how the urobiome actually exists in our body. So what did these amazing scientists and researchers do? So they used 16S ribosomal RNA gene sequencing, say that 10 times fast, and that identified bacteria by DNA signatures without needing to grow them. Super smart. My God, some of these scientists are so smart. They also used enhanced qualitative urine cultures, EQUC. This is Wolf et al. In the Journal of Clinical Microbiology in 2014. So they used larger volumes of urine, they used more media, they used varied atmosphere, and they also incubated for a lot longer, and therefore they were recovering organisms standard culture systematically misses, right? So they were like, how can we actually make up what the bladder actually looks like and how it actually exists in real time? And will that bring up more different culture species, basically? If we take a huge bit of urine and we make sure it's anaerobic and it's an anaerobic environment and we keep it and we culture it for a lot longer and we use different DNA sequencing, what can we find? And then we found so much more in this area. Alongside this, sampling really matters. So the urethra and the vagina have their own dense microbial communities. Peeing into a cup actually covers and captures a lot of bacteria that whenever in your bladder, right? So sometimes some cervical mucus can come out and that can negatively impact how we test, right? So we can go, wow, there's a lot of lactobacillus crispatus here. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe it is there, maybe it's not, okay? And that's why the field is still so young. It's just really, really hard to sample clearly. Also because we can't just put a swab in the urethra. That would really hurt. So that's why it's really, really hard and why this area of science is still developing. So what have we learned though? So in many women, the healthy bladder is dominated by lactobacillus species, particularly Lactobacillus crispatus, right? And so I think for a long time, scientists were like, maybe that's just from the vaginal microbiome. But now we know it's probably from the bladder as well. So Lactobacillus crispatus, we spoke about that in the podcast with Dr. Moira Bradfield-Stratum. I talk about that a lot on my channel as well and my Instagram and stuff. Anyway, the same species that dominates that healthy vaginal microbiome has that same neighbor, right? So these lactobacilli, they produce lactic acid and antibacterial compounds that keep all of the pathogens that could be in the bladder in check. So it's resistant to colonization, basically. It's too acidic, so nothing can live there. So what happens when we have dysbiosis, which is the loss of lactobacillus dominance? And we can also see the expansion of Gardnerella, which is associated with bacterial vaginosis. So that's been associated with urge incontinence, overactive bladders, and increased UTI susceptibility. So we have to note the word here, associated. Most of this evidence is still correlational, okay, not causal. Correlation is this and this is correlated. Causation is we know this causes this. We have not reached causation, okay? The paradigm we understand around this has shifted a lot, but the clinical evidence has not been fully built out yet. So keyword, associated. And the caveat here that I think is really interesting is the wellness industry has already raced ahead of the science here. So bladder probiotic products are being sold and the evidence base for most of these products for women does not exist. Okay. It does not exist. So if you're taking a bladder probiotic, maybe don't. Also because it's just the same as taking Lactobacillus crispatus. Okay. It's probably just a lot more expensive as well. Let's move on to why antibiotics are necessary, but not sufficient. Okay. If you have an UTI, you need antibiotics. Full stop. Okay. Do not treat an active UTI with cranberry juice, D-mannose, uva ursi, apple cider vinegar, or any supplement that you saw a wellness influencer talking about it. Those are great for prevention. But if you have a UTI, if you have a symptomatic UTI, you need antibiotics. Okay? Right? All of these things that I said before, D-mannose, uva ursi, apple cider vinegar, wonderful. I think they're great. They will not work reliably, okay? If it descends into your kidneys while you experiment with these things, the consequences can be really, really, really severe. This is not a treat at home, okay? I said that before. So the first line agents for an uncomplicated cystitis. So when you go to your pharmacy in Australia, they can do it over the counter after a small interview with your amazing pharmacists who have studied for so long and we love them. So the first one is nitrofurantoin. And so that is 100 milligrams twice a day for about 5 days. The next one is trimethoprim. So that's 160 to 800 milligrams twice daily for 3 days if local resistance is under 20%. Then we have some other ones like fosfomycin. That's a single 3-gram dose. And then we have pivmethicillin. So that's a European first line for decades. More recently, it's coming into the US. We usually in Australia, trimethoprim is the one that you will see most likely. There are other ones too, like ciprofloxacin. I'm trying to pronounce these correctly. And beta-lactams. They're okay. Like some of them are FDA restricted for uncomplicated cystitis, but the other ones that I said previously, they're first line agents and you should go with those. The paradox here though is that every single antibiotic course further depletes the commensal lactobacillus populations in your gut, your vagina, and in your bladder. So those are the exact populations providing colonization resistance, and the intervention that clears the current infection of E. coli most likely is actually creating the environment that makes the next one most likely. And so that's why in that 2025 AUA reordering of the evidence towards non-antibiotic preventions matters so much. Like if you actually look into that guideline, there is a big emphasis on how can we prevent these, because we can't just keep slapping antibiotics on this over and over and over again and then expect something different, because then we are actually creating antibiotic resistance. We're ruining the microbial communities here that prevent it in the first place. So that's what I really liked about that 2025 reordering of the evidence and that guideline around UTIs for women. Okay, so let's get into the prevention evidence. Let's reorder it, okay? So framework reminder, Top tier is large, well-designed RCTs or meta-analyses. Mid-tier is mechanistically plausible with mixed evidence. So we don't know. Maybe we've just found this out. We're just building the evidence, or we thought this was really good and we found out that it's not. Low tier, preliminary, small, or heavily anecdotal. Okay. Top tier, vaginal estrogen. So I think a lot of women who are going through menopause, so peri and postmenopausal women, this group of women are really, really highly associated with the development of UTIs. And one of the reasons why is because estrogen proliferates and supports the proliferation and colonization of Lactobacillus crispatus in the bladder and in the vagina, okay? So whenever we see dysbiosis in the vagina, we also see it in the bladder for women who are peri and postmenopausal, okay? So if you're peri or postmenopausal with recurrent UTIs and or vaginal dysbiosis, please take this one thing from this episode: vaginal estrogen. Please, 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 please do it. Please do it, okay? Don't believe all of that rubbish from years ago that it increases the risk of breast cancer. I'm going to do a whole episode on that, okay? Trust me. I've got a few articles on my Substack and Patreon about how safe hormone replacement therapy and specifically vaginal estrogen is. Please, please, please. It's the single most effective non-antibiotic prevention strategy available, okay? It's underprescribed at scale, and that's really disturbing to me. So what's the mechanism here? Estrogen drops at menopause. pH in your vagina rises, which is not a good thing, okay? That's more alkaline. And that means that your reproductive age lactobacilli will deplete significantly. And that means that it's less acidic and we are more hospitable to dysbiosis. So think more Gardnerella, think more Candida, right? So this is why so many women who have never had a UTI in their entire lives start having them in their 50s. Vaginal estrogen restores lactobacilli, okay? It reacidifies the vaginal pH, it restores the barrier without significant systemic estrogen exposure. So if that's something you're worried about, even though I've just said that it's not something you should worry about that much, vaginal estrogen, please, please, please. It's really, really great. It's safe for the vast majority of women, including many with a history of breast cancer, if discussed appropriately with your oncologist and with your gyno, okay? So what's the evidence? Cochrane review in vaginal non-oral estrogen significantly reduces recurrence. Tan Kim et al. In 2023, they looked at 5,638 women. They looked at annual UTI frequency and it dropped from 3.9 to 1.8 after they started using vaginal estrogen. So that's about a 52% reduction. So if you are having 6 a year, you go down to 3. If you are having 3, you go down to 1. That's pretty good, right? And when we look in the 2025 AUA guideline, the moderate recommendation is grade B evidence. So it's not A, but we know it's B, which is still pretty great. So if your GP or gyno are hesitant, I would be surprised if they are. They shouldn't be if they've been reading the evidence, which is their job. Print out the guideline and take it in. It is, without a doubt, the most underutilized evidence intervention in the whole UTI space. Okay? All right. Next is methenamine hippurate. I'm going to spell that out so you can Google it because this girl, I love her. She's a girl's girl. She's going to help you a lot. If you're thinking, I'm cycling, I don't really want to do vaginal estrogen, it might work for you. There is some evidence around that, but it's mostly for post and perimenopausal women. This one is for you. So I'm going to spell it out. Ready? methenamine. Next word, hippurate. 8. Because she does. So this is the drug most people, including GPs, have never heard of. And now it's guideline endorsed as a first-line option for recurrent UTIs. So how does it work? So it converts formaldehyde in acidic urine. So formaldehyde acts as a non-antibiotic urinary antiseptic. Basically, it kills bacteria in the urine directly, not anywhere else. Okay, so it's not an antibiotic. It does not drive antibiotic resistance. It does not deplete your gut microbiome. So what's the evidence around here? So Hardling et al. In BMJ of 2022, they looked at 240 women in the UK and they used it, right? They used 1 gram twice daily versus a normal prophylactic antibiotic. So asymptomatic UTI incidence, 1.38 per person per year on methenamine versus 0.89 on antibiotics. Okay, not a huge difference. So if you are wanting to take something that is a non-antibiotic, we know it can decrease symptomatic UTI incidence pretty significantly, okay? There is a differentiation with pre-specified and non-inferiority margins in that study, but whatever. So what is that translated? So a non-antibiotic intervention performed approximately as well as daily antibiotics without the resistance or the dysbiosis costs. Okay. So if you are a woman on a long-term antibiotic for recurrent UTIs, methionine hippurate could be a conversation that you could have with your doctor that you could start having and start taking and see what happens. I would love to see a longitudinal study in this, like 3-4 years. That would be great because we would actually see, are these women who are on the antibiotic, are they taking it more often? And are we starting to see gut and vaginal dysbiosis? So is there some negative outcome with this medication versus what happens with the women who are taking this non-antibiotic, right? Do we see that they have less incidence of vaginal and gut and also your bladder dysbiosis? And we're also seeing a decrease in UTIs. I think that would be really fascinating, but more on this space. It's coming. The next one, drum roll, surprisingly high up in this guideline, increased water intake. It sounds obvious, but the trial data on it is really strong. So Houghton et al. In JAMA Internal Medicine in 2018, they looked at 140 premenopausal women drinking less than 1.5 liters a day, and they randomized to an additional 1.5 liters a day or usual intake. So they had two groups. One was not drinking that much water. The other one was drinking more water. So over 12 months, the mean cystitis episode fell from 3.2 to 1.7. Mean antibiotic courses fell from 3.6 to 1.9. We are seeing these women literally drinking just double the amount of water. So from 1.5 liters to 3 liters. They saw their cystitis go down by half and their antibiotic courses falling down by half as well. Drink your water, girls. Please drink your water. So the time between infections also stretched as well from 84 days to 143 days. So the caveat here though, the effect was low in low volume drinkers specifically. So piling more water onto already adequate intake is not showing any benefit. It's just if you're a low water drinker, if you don't drink a lot of water in the day, you can really make a huge difference by drinking more water. I'm so sorry. It's so obvious, but I had to point it out because the evidence is really interesting and obvious, at least to me. The next is cranberry. You knew it was coming. So there is a huge image problem here, okay? So it sounds like folk medicine and it's marketed by juice companies for decades. And this is argued back and forth in the literature. But when we look into the literature, so 2023 Cochrane review by Williams et al., they looked at 50 randomized control trials that included 8,857 participants. So this is a huge study. The relative risk for symptomatic culture identified as 0.7 overall and 0.74 in recurrent UTIs. Okay, so the mechanism behind this is that A-type antibiotic, PACs, they inhibit binding of P. fimbriae, which is a second E. coli adhesion, to the receptors. Okay, so basically, cranberry can stop the hook from working, one of the other hooks from working inside the bladder. There's lots of caveats around cranberry juice though, okay? Product quality varies really quite enormously. PAC content is often not disclosed on the packaging, right? So PAC is the kind of the one we want to look for. PACs are in the cranberry juice and they stop that hook from working. A supermarket cranberry juice cocktail is mostly sugar. It does not deliver any therapeutic PAC dose. And if you use instead a standardized extract with disclosed PAC content, you're going to be a lot better off. And again, this is not treatment. This is prevention. Okay, so those were all of our top tier. Let's move on to our mid tier. First one is probiotics. So really compelling when we look at the mechanistic rationale, but when we look into the clinical data, it's pretty mixed. So the mechanism here, if we restore the protective vaginal and gut lactobacillus populations, that's going to positively impact the bladder, right? So in a Stapleton et al. Study, basically they called it the Lactin V trial, they used vaginal lactobacillus crispatus. So when they reduced lactobacillus crispatus, or they saw a reduction in vaginal lactobacillus crispatus in women, it did not reach a statistical significant overall. So they didn't see a change in UTIs in women, but there was a strong dose-dependent response in the women who were successfully colonized. So basically, when we take healthy women and we see a reduction in their vaginal lactobacillus, we didn't see any change in their UTIs. But if we took women with low lactobacillus and we brought it up, we did see a reduction in UTIs in that group, which is pretty interesting. And so that's why it's mid-tier, because it's a bit mixed. A different study, so Gupta et al. In 2024, combined oral and vaginal probiotics reduced reoccurrence rate of UTIs, so lactobacillus crispati, putting it in your vaginal microbiome. So you're putting it as a pessary inside of your vaginal canal, and you're also taking it orally. We saw a reduction. That's cool. So strain, dose, and delivery route all really matter a lot, and consumer products rarely match the specific formulations used in these trials, okay? So if you are like, okay, that sounds great, I want to try and do an oral and a vaginal, you want to look for Lactobacillus crispatus, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, GR1, maybe Lactobacillus reuteri RC14, okay? Those are the ones that we see in trial doses, ideally from a company disclosing the strain level detail as well. Next up, we have postcoital antibiotics. Yes, antibiotics that you take specifically after you have sex. So they're shown to be effective, but they're in mid-tier because the mechanism is an antibiotic. And we know with this also comes resistance and dysbiosis, and those costs still apply. So for a woman who consistently gets a UTI after sex, a single dose of targeted antibiotic within a couple of hours of intercourse can really dramatically reduce the reoccurrence of that UTI. But again, the risks associated with a depletion in your microbiome, in your bladder, are significant, and it's not associated with a kind of a supported microbiome there that's going to naturally decrease the reoccurrence. It's mid-tier because there's risk. Low tier. Okay, let's give it to you straight. I've been asked this 1,000 times. Previously, the D-mannose, it was like, wow, this is amazing. And I recommended this and I've used this. And I think it has been effective anecdotally for me, I think. But the more you look into the evidence now, after the huge trials have been done, the wellness industry has not caught up with this, okay? There are still people online saying that D-mannose is the best thing since cut bread for UTIs, and it's just not true. The mechanism is still beautiful, okay? And I love that for her. So free mannose sugar competitively binds for the FIM-H adhesin. Remember that hook? That's on E. coli. So it's like a big mannose sugar party. Here's all the sugar in the world. And E. coli goes, whoa, 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 whoa. Hooks on and then is mechanistically taken out with urine flow. Okay, so that's really the kind of intervention that should work. When we looked into early trials, so in Cranjack in 2014, this was an open label study. It was really promising, and this enthusiasm around D-mannose really built. And then from that singular study, which was, I guess it was a primary study, a lot of people got really excited and products really started to flood the market. And then the definitive trial, which is in Merit. So Hayward et al., JAMA International Medicine 2024. It's called Merit. They looked at 598 women in UK. They took 2 grams a day of D-mannose versus a placebo, double blind for 6 months. The result was clinically suspected UTI in 51% of D-mannose versus 56% of placebo. That's not good. That shows no benefit. There's only a 5% reduction in D-mannose, okay? The authors, this is a near direct quote, D-mannose should not be recommended to prevent future UTIs in women with recurrent UTIs in primary care. And then we've also seen subsequent meta-analyses confirm the pooled effect that is not statistically significant. So a bit awkward for the gut experts online, isn't it? Does this mean that D-mannose does nothing for any woman ever? No. Okay, individual response is real. I just spoke about it. If it works for you, I'm not there to tell you to stop. I'm just saying that don't choose D-mannose over any of the top tier evidence that I just spoke about, okay? I would rather see a woman on vaginal estrogen or methenamine hippurate than on D-mannose if she was choosing between them, okay? Lastly, let's talk about behavioral interventions and myth busting. So this is counterintuitive. The behavioral interventions that dominate like the public conversation and also the private conversation between you and your doctor is wiping direction, urinating after sex. Don't go in hot tubs. Don't go and wear heaps of tight underwear. Don't douche your vagina, which I don't think you should do your vagina anyway. I digress. So these have all been examined individually and also some of them collectively in case control studies, and they've also been incorporated into that 2025 AUA guideline. They did not meaningfully reduce reoccurrence. This does not mean stop doing them, okay? Wiping front to back is not going to harm you, statistically speaking, but if you are already doing all of that faithfully and still getting infections, do not spend another minute of your life blaming yourself and sitting there and watching your doctor try and blame you, okay? So 2 behavioral interventions exist with real evidence. Increased fluid intake in low volume drinkers that we spoke about previously, and discontinuing your spermicide and diaphragm contraception. So if you have UTIs and you're using spermicide and or diaphragm. Both of those really seriously disrupt the protective vaginal lactobacillus crispatus. And if you use those and you have recurrent UTIs, if you just change your contraceptive method a little bit and you see improvement, that's actually one of the highest yields interventions that we have behaviorally as well. Next, let's talk about the vaccine frontier. It's all very exciting. So UTI vaccines are real. One is now available in about 26 countries. Results are frankly really extraordinary compared to any supplement that we've spoken about here. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about MV140, also known as Euroimmune. It is a sublingual spray. So you just spray it under your tongue daily for 3 months. Yes, that's all it is. That's a vaccine. How wonderful is that? So it contains whole cell inactivated preparations in the four most common uropathogens. So using that sublingual route induces mucosal and T-cell immunity. Okay, and you can find all of this out from the pivotal trial done by Lorenzo Gomez et al. In NEJM evidence of 2022. So this was a double-blind RCT. They used 240 women, and this was done in Spain and the UK. So 3 months of dosing produced infection-free rates of 56% of the women at 3 months and 58% at 9 months versus 25% for the placebo, which took none. Median number of infections fell from 3 to 0. So most of these women were experiencing 3 infections a year, and it fell down to 0. And the median time for first infection went from 48 days to 275 days. Wow. Okay, so that's really crazy, right? High quality data from a properly designed randomized control trial. Okay. That's the reason why MV140 is now available in 26 countries, including Australia, via named patient access. Okay. So if you have recurrent UTIs and you have not found relief from top tier prevention strategies, MV140 is really, really, really worth talking to your GP, your urologist, your gynecologist about. Right? Further RCTs are underway, including one in Australia, which is really, really exciting. Okay, so that's the sublingual vaccine. Really, really cool. What about the other one that we heard about, right? So the EX-PEC9V failure. So the context here really matters. Let's talk about it. So in February of 2025, a very, very large, very, very, very expensive phase 3 trial failed. So EX-PEC9V by Jasson and Sanfori. This is an injectable 9-valent conjunctant vaccine. So it's designed to prevent invasive E. coli disease by including bloodstream infection in older adults with a UTI history. So the E.Brace, so the EMBRACE trial, halted really early. Independent data monitoring committee showed that it was not sufficiently effective compared to the placebo. So SUFU took a $250 million charge on the program. That's really sad, isn't it? So basically what I'm saying is mechanistically this looked perfect, but it did not guarantee clinical effectiveness. So they showed that the placebo was doing as good as the vaccine. So they said this trial is over because it's not showing benefit. Therefore, it can cause harm to the people who are in this trial. So that's why I closed. Okay, let's talk about chronic UTIs and the ecosystem view. So I think we've touched on this a little bit. So recurrent and chronic UTIs are not really a single bladder problem. It's an ecosystem across 3 connected niches. So niche 1 is the gut. So this is the primary reservoir for E. coli, where the bacteria that end up in your bladder actually live. So in Warby et al. In Nature Microbiology in 2022, women with these recurrent UTIs have distinct gut microbiome profiles. So they generally, they will have reduced diversity and expanded E. coli populations. Okay, so if you have a gut like that, you're a lot more likely to have a vaginal dysbiosis problem and a bladder dysbiosis problem. So gut E. coli abundance rises 7 to 14 days after antibiotic treatment. So that's why if you were in Bali and you got Bali belly and you took an antibiotic and then you have a UTI, it's because after 2 weeks of taking that, E. coli can rise. And so that's why we generally see that association between antibiotics and the development of UTIs, because E. coli is like, great, all of these really beneficial microbes are out of the way. They've been wiped out. So I can be opportunistic and I can grow and colonize. Niche 2 is the vagina. So this provides either colonization resistance through lactobacillus dominance, or it's a launch pad for uropathogen ascension when lactobacillus is depleted. So how does lactobacillus get depleted? Menopause, because we don't have any estrogen. Antibiotics, what we just spoke about before. Spermicides and some hormonal contraceptives can drop lactobacillus as well. So once vaginal microbiomes shift, the uropathogens like E. coli have somewhere to establish before the short climb up to the urethra. Niche 3 is the bladder wall. Okay, that's where the IBCs and the QIRs live, and that's why symptoms come back 6 weeks and then 6 weeks and then 6 weeks after clean courses of antibiotics, okay, because the infection has never fully cleared. It was suppressed enough there that you were asymptomatic, but the reservoir of E. coli and other pathogens is still there. And so we uncover this really vicious cycle, right? So each antibiotic course clears the current infection, but the cost is large, right? It depletes the commensal populations providing colonization resistance, so Lactobacillus crispatus mostly, creating an acidic environment. It increases the risk of the next infections, and that next infection will need more antibiotics, and then that further depletes the microbiome, and so on and so on. And also inside of this is that massive problem of antibiotic resistance, okay? Every time we use antibiotics, the risk of antibiotic resistance can increase. Let's talk about the chronic UTI controversy. Okay, so let's address this just because I know a few of you are dealing with symptoms that fall between the cracks. So your culture comes back negative. Your GP tells you it's all in your head. You have been given antidepressants when you know that something is really wrong. So what's going on here? That's the underlying science of embedded intracellular infection, and that's legitimate, okay? So IBCs and QIRs are real, and standard urine culture does miss these persistent infections, particularly ones dominated by bacteria that do not grow well under those standard conditions, okay? So that's a really genuine and unmet need. Women reporting these symptoms are not making it up. If you're a health provider and you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, why do I have so many menopausal women coming to me saying that they have UTIs when they don't? You should fucking listen to them. Consider listening to women. Did you know that there's like 40 grams of protein in listening to women? I digress. So the specific long course antibiotic protocols used by some chronic UTI clinics, months to over a year of continuous antibiotic exposure, sounds super good and healthy, rest on observational and patient reported data, not RCTs. That's a real risk, okay? Real risk number 1, antibiotic resistant. Risk 2, gut dysbiosis. Those have longitudinal negative health impacts over the lifespan. But I think when you present to someone and you say, I have an infection, I think health providers are like, UTIs are so serious and they can kill this person, so we just need to wipe it out. And I understand that, but there also needs to be a conversation around, I've seen you 6 times in the past year. This is really concerning. How can we prevent this from happening in the future? But health providers just haven't read through the literature to know about how to prevent this in the future, right? So chronic UTI as a diagnosis is at a genuine risk of being over applied. Sometimes it displaces other diagnoses like interstitial cystitis or pelvic floor dysfunction that also need treatment entirely and also can coexist with this. So let's talk about pelvic floor, baby. Okay, this is the last piece before we close up, the pelvic floor. I also have a podcast all about the pelvic floor with an amazing pelvic floor PT that we did in my gorgeous lounge room. Dr. Emma. So she's amazing. Go and listen to that. So basically, if the bladder does not empty completely, residual urine becomes a pool and this great playground where bacteria multiply between voids. And by void, I mean each pee. So mechanistically, this is a really obvious risk factor for recurrent UTIs. And it's actually one of the most under-investigated pieces of the puzzle in ordinary practice. So what are some of the causes of incomplete emptying? So pelvic floor dysfunction or dysfunctional voiding. This is where your pelvic floor and your urinary sphincter, they fail to relax during urination. So interrupted or saccto stream. So that's basically where you're not knowing when to stop. And so you might stop early or you might pee and stop and pee and stop and pee and stop. That's not normal. You should just pee and then you stop and there shouldn't be much left. Another one is pelvic organ prolapse, so anatomical descent kinks in the urethra, like a bent hose, basically. You can't actually fully release all of your urine. And there might also be that bladder muscle does not generate enough contraction to empty fully. So residual urine sits in the bladder itself, not the ureters. That's actually something I've seen in wellness circles a lot. And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Gravity will help it pull out. Maybe if you have a really big kink because of pelvic organ prolapse, that might be the case, but very often that's not. what can happen is when your bladder pressures rise or the flap valve where the ureters meet the bladder fails, the urine refluxes backwards and up into the ureters towards the kidneys. So that is called VUR, and that mechanism is by which incomplete emptying can predispose not just to infections and lower tract infections, so your ureter and your bladder, but also into your kidney. So the chain here, basically, I want you to understand: incomplete emptying, urine pooling in the bladder, bacterial overgrowth, and potentially reflux into the ureters and the kidneys that can lead to kidney infections as well. So what to do? If you have recurrent UTIs and you have an interrupted urine stream, if you don't feel like your bladder has fully emptied after urinating, if you need to go shortly after you've peed, those are symptoms of maybe some problems there. If you also have symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse, what do? Go to a pelvic floor physiotherapist. They're going to do a few exercises with you, and they'll assess whether if you're overactive or underactive and what's going on, and give you some exercises to do as well. You can also ask your GP or urologist for a post-void residual measurement, which is basically a really simple measurement, an ultrasound, where you go have a pee and you come back and they see if there's still some volume of urine in your bladder. Right. And then if you find any of those things are true, you can do some pelvic floor physiotherapy. And I've actually seen that be very, very successful for women. If you can fully let go of all of your pee, you're basically not allowing a good environment for E. coli to overgrow. Hopefully you enjoyed this podcast. Okay, I think I covered absolutely everything I needed to with UTI. I know I'm going to get a bunch of comments below. What about this? What about that? What about this supplement? Go and look at the guideline. Go and read the Substack. Go and read the Patreon article on this as well. You can access all of the references for the show notes in APA. We love that. I will see you on the next one. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to this episode. If you loved it, please remember to like, subscribe, and send to a loved one. If you want to learn more from Arc Woman, please check out the website at arcwoman.com.au, where you can find a plethora of offerings like charts, masterclasses, courses, and organic clothing. You can also head over to patreon.com/arcwoman or substack.com/arcwoman to join the community. I hope you have a really beautiful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world, and I will see you on the next episode.